Good morning. I'm Suzanne Stewart-Steinberg, the director of the Pembroke Center, and I am very, very happy to welcome you to this wonderful day to celebrate the Pembroke Center archives. The Pembroke Center loves doing big events in snowstorms. It's character building. Anyway, I'm glad everybody made it, and so we'd like to start. So, welcome to the Pembroke Center's conference, Archives Make History, the Pembroke Collections. I'm happy to offer a special welcome to our keynote speaker, Professor Marianne Hirsch, back to her alma mater. She is the William Peterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature and professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Columbia University. She has also pledged her scholarly papers to the Center's Feminist Theory Archive, and as a Brown alumna, her papers will also be accessible from the Christine Dunlap Farnham Archive. I'm grateful that Karen Newman is here with us today and will make some concluding remarks at the end of the conference. She is the Owen Walker Class of 33 Professor of Humanities and Professor of Comparative Literature and English at Brown University, is a past director of the Pembroke Center, and has also pledged her scholarly papers to the Feminist Theory Archive. I would like to extend a warm greeting to our panelists and moderators, Arlen Austin, Shira Buxbaum, Anne Ducil, Anne Fausto Sterling, Johanna Fernandez, Lauren Gilmet, Amy Kowalski, Peter McLuff, Mary Murphy, Mimi Peachy, Michelle Scully, and Jasmine Waddell. We look forward to hearing from all of you. Thanks go to the Pembroke Center staff for their work organizing today's conference, in particular Donna Goodnow, Martha Hamblett, Christy Law Blanchard, Mary Murphy, Whitney Pape, and Diane Straker. Thank you, all of you. Today's conference commemorates and strengthens the Pembroke Center's long-standing commitment to women's history and women's archives. In the early 1980s, the Pembroke Center began to collect materials about Brown Pembroke and Rhode Island women and established the Christine Dunlap Farnham Archive to hold these collections. The center established the Feminist Theory Archive in 2003 to collect the work of feminist theorists and to encourage research into the work of these path-breaking scholars and the interchange of ideas among them. We are tremendously pleased that these two archives complement one another so well. Bringing them together allows researchers to study the history of women at Brown and in Rhode Island alongside the history of feminist theory. Our partnership with the Brown University Library makes the many collections contained in both archives available for research, and we are grateful for the library's enthusiastic collaboration. The Pembroke Center could not have made this deep commitment to archiving women's history and feminist scholarship without the help of the Pembroke Center Associates, a group of alumni, parents, students, and friends who support our work. And so I would like to welcome Victoria Westhead, class of 1983, parent of students in the classes of 2017 and 2019, and chair of the Pembroke Center Associates Council, to the podium. Thank you.
Check that. Good morning, and thank you, Suzanne. I'm so pleased to welcome you all today to today's conference on behalf of the Pembroke Center Associates Council. This is a special day for us, and I'm delighted to see so many of you in the room, particularly given the treacherous weather and particularly the dire weather predictions. The Pembroke Center Associates, founded in 1983, began working to establish a women's archive from our earliest days. Christine Dunlap Farnham, class of 1948, was the founder and the first chair of the Pembroke Center Associates Council. The archive, devoted to the history of women, was an important effort of hers. Unfortunately, her life was cut short by a tragic car accident in 1984, and the center named the archive in her memory. One of our two archives, the Christine Dunlop Farnham Archive, focuses particularly on the history of women at Brown and in the state of Rhode Island. I would like to offer a special thank you to Jean Howard, class of 1970. She is the George Delacorte Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University and my predecessor as chair of the council. Jean played a major role in organizing today's conference and also chaired the committee that developed the Lamphere exhibit 2 years ago, which is now reinstalled on the first floor. I hope you've all had a chance to take a look at it. If you haven't, I urge you to do so. It's terrific. We are enormously grateful for all that Jean has done for the Pembroke Center. Thank you also to Bernestine McLeod Bailey, class of 1968, co-chair of the Archives Committee, and to all of the members of that committee for their commitment to this important aspect of our work. As Suzanne mentioned, this conference commemorates the Pembroke Center's longstanding commitment to archives, but today's event has another very important purpose. It is a celebration of the completion of the Pembroke Center Archives Endowment Campaign, led by Nancy L. Buck, class of 1965, and Nancy would have you know that the class of 1965 is the best class ever. The campaign had a goal of $3.5 million. Thanks to Nancy's tireless efforts and the generosity of many Pembroke Center associates and friends, we not only reached our goal, we surpassed it and raised over $3.7 million. And of course, we hope the endowment keeps growing, and that is a hint. This endowment has not only secured the future of both the Christine Dunlop Farnham Archive and the Feminist Theory Archive, it also allowed the center to hire its first full-time archivist, Mary Murphy. Where is Mary? There she is. With Mary in place, we're able to expand the pace of our collecting efforts and increase accessibility to the collections for research. The endowment is really a splendid gift for the Pembroke Center and for future generations. Please join me in thanking Nancy, the members of the Pembroke Center Associates Council, Christy Law Blanchard, who staffed the campaign, and I'm sorry to say whose last day it is today. She's going on to another job. Our partners in advancement, and all those who made gifts in support of this campaign, many of whom are here today. Thank you so much. And welcome all of you newcomers. And now I'd like to invite to the podium Ariella Azulay, Professor of Comparative Literature and Modern Culture and Media, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, good morning. It is a great pleasure and honor to present today Marianne Hirsch, a distinguished alumni of Brown University, the co-founder of the first Women's Studies program in the Ivy League at Dartmouth College, and a great force behind numerous collaborative feminist projects, edited volumes, educational programs, and Center of Interdisciplinary Studies. Many of us came to know Marianne Hirsch through a concept she introduced to the study of memory and trauma, the concept of post-memory, which became an essential part of the theoretical arsenal of researchers working in diverse geopolitical and historical contexts. Post-memory is a way to discover the way a non-personal element of narration and imagination is always weaved through one's most personal memories. Inseparable from memory, post-memory is still distinguished from it, in Marianne's words, and I'm quoting, by generational distance and from history by deep personal connection. Today, Marianne Hirsch is William Petterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and Professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a former president of the Modern Language Association of America. Of Hirsch's voluminous work, which combines feminist theory with memory studies, I will mention only some recent books. The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing and Visual Culture After the Holocaust, Columbia University Press, 2012. Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Chernovich in Jewish Memory, co-authored with Leo Spitzer, University of California Press, 2010. Rites of Return, Diaspora, Poetics, and the Politics of Memory, co-edited with Nancy Miller, Columbia University Press, 2011. And a collection of essays co-edited with Diana Taylor, and the summer 2012 issue of Miss Africa on the subject of archives. She is currently working on a co-authored book with Leo Spitzer, School Photos in Liquid Time, Archives of Possibility, and on a series of essays on the future of memory. Marian Hirsch is the former editor of PMLA and the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the ACLS, the Mary Ingram Banting Institute, the National Humanities Center, and the Bellagio and Bugliasco Foundations. She is one of the founders of Columbia's Center for the Study of Social Difference and its global initiative, Women Creating Change. Please join me in welcoming Marian Hirsch.
Thank you so much, Ariella, for this wonderful introduction. I'm going to try to pull up my PowerPoint. Can you see? I can't see the screen. Is it up there? No. Okay. Oops.
It was there.
Oh. Well, while we work on this, yep. I need to see what it looks like here. Oops, okay. Great, sorry about this. Okay, are you? Yep. Thank you so much for this invitation, and Ariella for this wonderful generous introduction. I'm very moved to be here. I realized sitting here that I took my first course at Brown over 50 years ago as a high school student in Providence, and my connection to Brown has been very firm ever since. I was on the very early days of the Pembroke Center Associates Council with Nancy Buck and Bernice Steen and some other people here. So it's moving and wonderful to be here. I'm going to talk about Archives of Possibility, and I hope you'll indulge me in a fantasy. It's 2027, and we're nearing the end of the second term of Michelle Obama's presidency. We're also nearing the 25th anniversary of the Pembroke Center's Feminist Theory Archives, which were founded in 2003. Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies is a thriving interdisciplinary academic field, undergraduate and graduate, housed in the university's Central Humanities Building. It shares a floor with cognate disciplines, African American, Indigenous, Ethnic, Environmental Studies, among others, and it draws on faculty from across the university, as well as on academics, artists, and activists from across the globe. A thriving research center down the hall hosts working groups that examine the dynamics of race, gender, sexuality, and power throughout history and across the globe, imagining alternative epistemological, psychological, and social structures for the future. One of my former students, now a tenured professor, has secured a grant from the Pembroke Feminist Theory Archives to teach the required undergraduate, graduate feminist theory course, using the archives as a basis for the course syllabus and a site for student projects. Let us call her Nicole. Following a broad national call to create materials and pedagogies for the transnational study of women's histories, the Pembroke Center has initiated a collaboration with feminist centers and archives in other parts of the world, linking documents and collections online, exchanging faculty and students. One of the requirements for Nicole's course is that it take advantage of these transnational efforts, and thus she looks forward to working with colleagues at feminist centers in Turkey, in Hungary, in Palestine, in China, and South Africa, all in network connection with Pembroke. Students located at these different centers will be able to learn together, exchanging materials, projects, and analyses. Innovations in virtual reality, of course, will enhance embodied collaborations with students and faculty at teaching sites linked across continents in a virtual classroom. Another goal stipulated by the grant is for the course not only to use the archives, but to reflect on the archive as an epistemological structure that produces the very history it's archiving. Feminists, along with other critical scholars, have argued that if we want to make space for alternative forms of collection and knowledge, for shifts in the logic of intelligibility and knowability, we need to question the very structure and conception of archives and the ways that they institutionalize knowledge. We need to redefine and open what constitutes an event or a life worth being remembered and transmitted to the future. We need to make space for counter-memories and for previously forgotten and ignored narratives, narratives that are potentially disruptive or subversive. The Pembroke Feminist Theory Archive emerges from this critical view of the archive as an official structure of knowledge. And so this transnational expansion in the 2020s is but the latest step in such an effort. So looking toward the archive's 25th anniversary, in 2028, it seems worth asking again, how do feminist archives and feminist theory archives in particular shift our structures of knowledge and intelligibility? What kind of past might they produce if the archive is connected to other sites of theory production across the globe? Courses such as Nicole's promise some fresh answers and new possibilities. So I hope you'll indulge me this morning as I map out Nicole's course preparation, her syllabus, and her assignments. What will her students have learned by the end of the semester? How will they remember our generation of feminist theorists? What does the archive reveal and what does it conceal about the genealogy or the genealogies of what we're calling feminist theory in the formation of the archive, a very specific product of second wave American feminism in connection with other European sites of feminist theory production? And how do particular archival practices enhance the generation and transmission of this knowledge and the imagining of feminist theoretical futures? So lucky for Nicole, the feminist theory archives are now all online, easily searchable. But as she begins to research her course, she realizes that she keenly wants her students to engage with the materiality of the objects and papers in the archive, to inhale, as the historian Carolyn Steedman puts it, the dust of the past. Innovations in haptics do enable such multisensory engagement, even without travel. But Nicole is still a product of the 20th century, and as she begins to research the papers of Naomi Shore, the Feminist Theory Archive's inaugural collection, she's eager to go through the boxes herself, literally, rather than virtually, to touch this young scholar's notebook, to see the handwriting inside it, so it's better to imagine the girl who would become an important theorist of French women's writing and of the detail. She will begin her own part of the course with Shore, she decides, and with one object in particular, and objects that she hopes will open up the possibilities and the limits of archives for her students. She zeroes in on a folder that contains notes for a 1994 course on French feminism. There's a course description, a page of handwritten notes that were most likely the basis of the typed description, and then there are 2 green Post-it notes, hard to read, but transcribed by the archivist. Depression today, disappearance of women in literature. I write as someone in mourning, which I hope will not be taken as a reactionary perspective. I loved the moment of feminist criticism in which the search for specificity was everything. But specificity is a dead concept. I mourn early feminism. I mourn the passage of, even as I know they are neither complete nor. Nicole loves the idea of starting with these Post-it notes. afterthoughts that remain unfinished, but that express mourning and regret for what in 1994 already seemed lost. But what exactly did Shore mourn? What was the unreadable word? How might she have finished the sentence? What does the post-it add to the course description and to the knowledge the archive transmits? Why is she worried about seeming reactionary? Can the archive slow or counteract the passage of whatever Shore was mourning, the passage of time, of lives, of ideas, by transferring the past into the future, however partially and imperfectly? These will be good questions to raise in class discussion, especially in relation to some of Shore's published work on the detail that Nicole also plans to assign. Isn't that what an archive is? A series of details. And let us note that in Shore's writing, the detail is coded as feminine. Details open up the past, even as they threaten to overwhelm us with minutiae that might obscure larger meanings. Or are those larger analyses precisely in the fragmentary and the small, in the resistance to monumental structures and stable interpretations? We might think of these details or fragmentary post-its, again in feminist terms, as points of memory. Following theorist Roland Barthes' notion of the punctum, which he discussed in relation to photography, points of memory can be seen as points of intersection between past and present that can interpolate those of us who seek to know. A point is small, conveying the fragmentariness of the vestiges of the past that come down to us in the present. Details, points of memory, can produce piercing insights that can traverse temporal, spatial, and experiential divides. As points multiply, they can convey the overlay of different temporalities and interpretive frames, resisting straightforward readings or any lure of authenticity. Nicole will introduce some of these ideas through Shore's post-its and the affects of nostalgia and mourning that they evoke, but that in their unfinished opacity, they also refuse. Delving deeper into Shore's papers, Nicole finds, first of all, the evolution of a scholar coming to feminism in the 1960s and 70s. Is this a linear story? How did scholarly and analytic questions evolve? And what institutional context facilitated or impeded such scholarly evolution? What were the pushes and pulls, the obstacles and opportunities, the balance between life and work? This last issue seems urgent. Feminist lives continue to be challenging, even in the late 2020s during Michelle Obama's presidency. These questions convince her to ask each student to choose one theorist to focus on for the semester, tracing the growth of a career in the context of published work, institutional affiliations, and evolving scholarly trends and shifting political climates. They would begin, of course, by tracing the theorist's idea of feminist theory, the central questions the work addresses. Within specific fields, the work's contribution to an ongoing set of questions about the workings of gender, sexuality, difference, and power. How wonderful to have research and reading notes and earlier versions of articles and books to peruse. How wonderful to peruse correspondence with publishers, to gain insights into the revision process. Graduate students particularly can learn what it takes to put a book together and to move from one project to the next, often reconsidering fundamental assumptions. On the basis of course syllabi and teaching files, they can see how teaching and research and writing intersect, how students contribute to our scholarship. And they can see how long it takes to develop an idea, to research it and nurture it through publication. At the same time, I hope you'll forgive me, Anne, they can also study the collecting practices of these scholars. Collecting is about the future, a future when we ourselves or others after us will want to look back on the past, placing it into a chain of continuity, measuring change and innovation. When did feminist theorists begin to see themselves as part of an emerging field? When did they begin to archive their scholarly, pedagogical, and administrative activities? How organized, how haphazard is a given theorist's collection? How, Nicole will ask her students, do the material practices of collecting inform the analyses and the narratives we can build about feminist theory? How, in fact, did these theorists envision their future and the future of the field they were building? Can the archive be read forwards rather than backwards for the possibilities these theorists envisioned rather than by way of the retrospective knowledge of some of the successes and some of the setbacks that define their project in retrospect? When did they begin to realize that they were participating in a revolution that would transform institutions and ways of thinking? And did their collecting practices reflect these conceptual transformation? Does the archive reflect this paradigm shift? In her beautiful book that I already cited, Dust, the Archive and Cultural History, Carolyn Steedman suggests that archival remains are encrusted in dust. For her, dust is a metaphor for, and I quote, the immutable, obdurate set of beliefs about the material world, past and present, with which modern history writing tries to grapple. Dust, now it's me again, in this hardened form, envelops and restricts the stories that can be told about the past by determining sequences, recognizable plots, beginnings and endings, thus delimiting explanations. But archival dust, as Steedman suggests as well, may also be more yielding, more revealing. As the organic byproduct of the slowly decomposing archival remnants and their unfiltered storage, it confirms, she writes, and I quote, a grand circularity of nothing ever going away. So dust, in this sense, is imperishable matter. It's waste and debris that does not disappear. And yet, I imagine that hovering in the air, stirred into motion by a breath, a breeze, the vibrations of a sound, the presence of a researcher, amorphous particles of dust might carry much that may yet be unthinkable about the past. Instead of defining and restricting narrative explorations of archival materials, dust can carry enabling elements for multiple resonances and interpretations. Working in the archive, even in the dustless digital archive, Nicole hopes that her students will find such open-ended narratives, and indeed something that may yet be unknown or as yet unthought or even unthinkable about this feminist past, and thus also about the feminist future. How to create this possibility so that instead of a stable repository, the archive becomes an engine of circulation, a set of acts or practices that mobilize different ways of thinking or are mobilized by them. Instead of valuing authenticity or legitimacy, Nicole wants her class to look at the archive as a site of potentiality, provisionality, contingency, consisting of dust, data, and traces that will be assembled and reassembled each time in different ways for use in an ever-changing present. The Shore collection contains more than a record of Naomi Shore's professional work. Nicole finds Shore's personal correspondence, her postcards and letters to her mother from abroad, the beautiful envelopes created by Naomi Shore's sister Mira, a feminist theorist in her own right. But there are also boxes of personal and professional letters exchanged with colleagues across the US and Europe, many of whose papers are also collected in the Feminist Theory Archive. Are Alice Jardine, Nancy K. Miller, Karen Newman, and many more. The letters of recommendation files are especially intriguing. Although they're restricted, and students will not be able to read the letters themselves, the list of people Shore wrote for might reveal something of the relationships and influences that shaped this community, or better said, these communities. As she considers this vast correspondence, along with conference programs and the collected volumes in which Shore's work was published, and as she sees box after box containing manuscripts and drafts by other feminist theorists that Shore was reading and commenting on, Nicole begins to wonder whether an archive cataloged by individual theorists can give a sense of a community of scholars whose members read each other, wrote to and for each other, disagreed and argued with one another, shaping something new and exciting together. She especially wants her students to sense the texture of these collaborative practices that convey Virginia Woolf's point in A Room of One's Own, that masterpieces are not single and solitary births. They're the outcome of many years of thinking in common, of thinking by the body of the people, so that the experience of the mass is behind each single voice. These lines of influence within and across generations of feminist theorists are certainly present in Naomi Shore's papers. But to get a sense of how feminists transformed or tried to transform institutions, how they worked together on committees, mentored each other, assumed administrative responsibilities, built academic programs, co-wrote or co-edited volumes and journals, how they co-organized conferences, colloquia, and speaker series, how they expanded their circles locally, nationally, transnationally, globally, within and outside academia, how they engaged in activism, how they built research centers like Pembroke. To get a sense of all that might require a different approach than studying individual theorists who donated their papers to the archive. Of course, individual collections do contain records of some of these collaborative practices that shaped feminist theory. And they each also give a sense of the limits of conversation and collaborations, the limited reach of conferences, letters, volumes, and collaborative efforts. But do they also account for the creative conversations and the crushing or enabling disagreements, the conflicts, divisions, and competitions that are part of collaboration and collectivity, which defines the work of feminist theory? Is there an archive of feelings, to use Anne Cvetkovich's phrase, for feminist theory, and how to find it? Nicole wants her students to see feminist theory not as a set of teleologically evolving intellectual questions relating to gender, power, and social difference, but as the process of creating the possibilities for these conceptually new questions to emerge. What kinds of institutional contexts enabled and enable feminist thinking? Nicole decides to stick with the Shore papers to see where they would lead her in her search for records of community connectivity and conceptual revolution. She begins to look at some of Shore's own collaborative work. She comes to a co-edited volume on Irigaray, another on difference, co-edited with Elizabeth Weed. Then there's Shore's work as co-editor of the flagship journal Differences, and the volumes to which Shore contributed. She stops over one of the first articles Naomi Shore published in a feminist-edited journal, the 1981 issue of Yale French Studies, Feminist Readings, French Texts, American Contexts. Naomi Shore contributed an essay on female paranoia and psychoanalytic feminist criticism. Now, there's a promising topic for insights into the archive of feelings of the generation of feminist theories, Nicole thinks. The issue itself is co-edited by 7 women, and as I'm one of the 7, Nicole decides to look at the issue more closely and to turn to my papers in the archive to see what more she could find out about the process of putting such an issue together in 1981. Sadly, there's a dearth of information beside the issue itself, which is available on JSTOR. In my papers, she finds only one file labeled YFS Rejects. Interesting to see the different handwritings on the mimeographed comment sheets attached to each of the 5 rejected articles, and also the preparatory notes about a meeting at the 1980 Houston MLA conference that resulted in a conversation among a number of American feminist theories about French feminism that appears in the issue's introduction. Nicole finds more about the process of collaboration in the introduction to the issue itself. The narrative seems quite detailed and revealing. This is a very unusual issue of Yale French Studies, the introduction begins, in that its guest editor is a 7-headed monster from Dartmouth. Its gender is feminine, and its orientation for this issue is feminist. The story of the collaboration of both its attractions and its pitfalls is spelled out in the section that follows, giving a vivid sense of the interpersonal and institutional context that engendered this project. Called Feminist Reading Collectivity as Method, the section traces the institutional context of an all-male school that had recently begun to admit women students and to hire female faculty, including in Romance languages, where the 7 of us met and worked. It outlined our male senior colleagues' warnings about the risks we were taking in presenting collaborative work for tenure, and their assurances that it would absolutely not be counted. And it discusses our defiant perseverance in quite celebratory terms. As we write, we attempt to, and I quote, "We attempt to challenge the inherently competitive characterization of critical discourse as intellectual property. Rather than allowing ourselves to be pitted against each other, we choose to combine effort, responsibility, and recognition." Reading this narrative, Nicole believed she could sense the excitement we were feeling at both infiltrating the power structures by bringing feminism to a traditional journal like Yale French Studies, and by challenging the tenure system through collaboration. Her impressions were only confirmed when she went to a chapter on female friendship in my 1997 book, Family Frames, to find both a photo documenting the seven-headed monster co-editing the introduction, co-writing and then editing the co-writing, and an account of what working in that group had meant to me. We look very earnest in this post photograph I write in that chapter, poring over typed pages of our manuscript. We don't smile or engage the photographer, nor do we look at one another. Although some of the tensions in the group may already be visible in this picture, I have kept it in my office always. Much has evolved for the individuals depicted in the photo and for the group as a whole: departures, tenure denials, personal rivalries, continuing friendships. But for me, seeing myself embedded visually in this oval-shaped group working together on a project of great urgency has remained, in spite of the difficulties, an idealized moment in my professional career, as tenuous and fleeting as the click of the shutter would indicate. Departures, tenure denials, personal rivalries. Now there's a different story from the introduction. Nicole is intrigued. Searching a bit further, she discovers more clues, particularly an essay by Jane Gallup in her 1992 book, Around 1981, that discusses, it has a chapter devoted to the YFS 62 issue. In fact, Jane Gallup's The Monster in the Mirror is pretty scathing, if humorous, a critique of the YFS issue. In Gallup's reading, the seven-headed monster from Dartmouth is, quote, quite funny, non-human it might be, but nonetheless Ivy League. She continues, the image of the monster thinly disguises a monstrous narcissism. This reader, for one, recoils from such unseemly self-congratulation. The irony of this irony is that when the editors say they are beautiful, they become ugly. Whoa, now we have some of the archival feelings of feminist theory, Nicole thinks. Gallup's essay is part of this book, Around 1981, that does close and what she calls symptomatic readings of a number of anthologies of feminist literary criticism and theory published between 1972 and 1987. Through this detailed attention to anthologies as the place in which to trace both the formation of a field and its institutionalization, Gallup can reveal what she calls a kind of collective unconscious of a field that is defined by its contradictions. She engages in what she calls an act of demystification to chip away at certain reigning myths of what has gone on in feminist literary criticism. And indeed, her reading of YFS 62 chips away at the myth of collectivity and collaboration that the issue's introduction upholds, and that in my chapter in Family Frames ever so gently questions. Both in the introduction and in my essay in the YFS issue, which she ingeniously, if really painfully for me, reads against each other, she finds the contradictions that define collectivity, both the desire to be part of the group and the struggle against its inhibitions and constraints. So Nicole goes back to my papers to find out more about YFS 62, but there's no record of Jane Gallup's assertion that, quote, in 1979, I received a letter from 7 Dartmouth women inviting me to contribute to a feminist issue of Yale French Studies they were editing. Jumping at the chance to be published in the top journal in my field, I immediately sent them an abstract on Irigaray and Freud. I never received an answer. This absolute lack of response was for me worse than rejection. Now Nicole decides to call me, and we plan to get together. She needs to supplement a fragmentary paper trail with oral history, though she has no illusions about the contingencies of personal and institutional memory, so many decades removed. Well, remember, it's 2027, so I'm, at this point, happily retired from teaching, writing, enjoying the auspicious political times when many of my dreams are finally coming to reality. I have to confess that I'm a bit embarrassed at the mess I handed to Pembroke when I sent my files there on the occasion of my retirement. Earlier papers were in file folders and notebooks, but we never found a record of Jane Gallup's submission, I assured Nicole, and I also told her that Jane and I became friends after we worked through her response to YFS 62. Looking for the record of that continued friendship proved difficult, however. I was never able to archive my Facebook page, before Facebook disappeared, and the hard disks I donated contained years of Word documents I could myself no longer open. Photos too were lost, as I thought I was storing them on the cloud and thus neglected to download them before the cloud disappeared. You will have to take my word for our friendship, I told Nicole, as some of the records of it have succumbed to digital rot. But yes, there's definitely a story here, and it's one you won't find in the archive. Just after our issue was published, we heard, much to our dismay, that Jane Gallup, already a very well-known theorist and brilliant reader of Freud, Lacan, and French feminist theory, was giving a talk about our journal issue in several places. She gave it at Yale, no less. And it was said to be quite the performance. In my own essay in the issue, an essay on Madame de Lafayette's La Princesse de Clèves as a mother-daughter story rather than a love triangle, I use a phrase Gallup cheerfully deconstructs. I wrote, "To study the relationship between mother and daughter is not to study the relationship between two separate, differentiated individuals, but to plunge into a network of complex ties to attempt to untangle the strands of a double self, a continuous multiple being of monstrous proportions, stretched across generations, parts of which try desperately to separate and delineate their own boundaries." Now, the repetition of the word monstrous, the struggle for separation and individuation, the fact that I'm the only one of the 7 to have an essay in the issue, all this was grist for Gallup's mill. If there's a blind spot in any part of the issue, and how could there not be, she found it and gleefully pointed it out. But there's more. At Yale, and later at several other schools, Brown perhaps, I'm not sure anymore, and later at Penn, where I was on the podium as a respondent, Jane wore a skirt made of men's ties, as a literalization of the network of complex ties in my essay. Well, I tell Nicole, this was the humor of the 1980s. But it was also incredibly wounding, and we all thought uncollegial and unsisterly. Of course, none of us remembered that we had failed to respond to her abstract, but be that as it may, we were convinced that she had misread the institutional situation we were in profoundly. And this is what I said in my response at the feminist conference at Penn. By exposing us to senior male colleagues at these prestigious institutions, male colleagues who had already told us not to do this work, she clearly failed to see the context in which we were working. For her, we had power. We were in the Ivy League, whereas she was teaching in Texas. But in our own eyes, we were incredibly vulnerable, and I guess none of us were trained in the analysis of privilege that we actually all shared. The 7 of us were all in the same department, Romance Languages. 2 of the 7 of us had earned tenure with enormous difficulty. A third was coming up soon, and the other 4 were all coming up in the same year. It was not clear whether there was a quota, but we knew we were in every way competing against each other, or even as some of us were going to be judged by some of the others. None of this was in the introduction, of course, but it was a palpable undercurrent of our work and of our determination to counteract the noxious effects of a system of competition and what seemed like a zero-sum game. As unexciting as it may sound, in the 1970s and 80s, the feminist mission was to get as many women and male faculty of color tenure as possible, so that once in, we could try to transform the system from the inside. But often the obstacles seemed insurmountable, and one of the obstacles was the way the system divided us against each other. There's more to say, of course. Gallup is a smart reader, and she found a great deal between the lines, but none of what I'm telling you could actually be found in the archive. I can only say this to you, Nicole, because we're good friends. Even so many years later, conflict and competition among feminists is difficult to talk about. Why was I the only one who had an essay in the volume, for example? How did we co-write an introduction in 7 voices folded into one? Again, compromises, disappointments, adjustments. The work on Yale French Studies was amazing, and the result was a great issue, historic, but the process was tough. Now there's your archive of feelings, Nicole. Nicole has videotaped our conversation. She asked whether I mind if she put it on the course website for students to consult. And she suggests that her students could interview some of the other people involved in this particular issue, so that the class might, at least in some small way, evaluate the potentials of oral history as a supplement to the archive. I told her I'd have to think about all this. I worry that my words and images would carry too much of a sense of truth value or authenticity for the students that what I considered a story of feminist conflict and institutional critique would be read as a set of nostalgic personal reminiscences. Before leaving, Nicole asks, and I detect an ironic smile, whether I join Naomi Shore in saying I miss early feminism. I don't know what to say. The visit leaves me anxious.
Oops, sorry.
After retiring from Columbia and sending my papers to Pembroke, I was eager to be done, to move forward rather than reliving my own feminist past. I'd done a lot of personal writing about painful political histories, my own and that of my parents and grandparents. I taught the Genealogies of Feminism course on several occasions, persuaded that early histories are important to recall and preserve. And in some cases, these teaching experiences provided quite personal occasions to re-experience the exhilarating urgency and passion that fueled both the accomplishments and the disagreements and disappointments, the failures of those years. But now I wanted to live in what I hoped would be a newly feminist present, to look to the future. And yet a lot of my work is based on oral history, and I appreciate its value, not just in supplementing more traditional archives, but in opening up the emotional life of the past and the contradictions that shape the act of recall. Thinking about Nicole's students, I worry that we're not leaving them enough if we restrict the archive to what is on paper, on our hard disks, on YouTube. I think of all the stories that feminist theories might share in a series of collected oral histories about the unexpected connectivities that an expanded transnational oral history archive could reveal. Is not the archive, in Giorgio Agamben's terms, quote, the system of relations between the unsaid and the said? Oral history seems an appropriate vehicle to capture not just the unsaid, but this very system of relations. Oral history is full of pitfalls, however. Not only do we misremember the past, but we also recall it from the vantage point of our present-day needs and desires. Oral history brings the archive into the present, not just through the process of selection and classification, but through a form of elaboration. In Paul Connerton's terms, it can add incorporated memories to the forms of memory that are inscribed. As I look back at the papers I've donated, I realize how much they fail to tell what I might want to transmit, not for nostalgic reasons only, I guess, but to flesh out details and fragments precisely from a privileged point of retrospection. The archive is not just a site of preservation, it's also a site of desire. How can we ensure that it conveys not just what was, but what Ariella Azoulay calls potential history, what might have been? I suggest to Nicole that oral history interviews might be most productive if they're focused quite pointedly on specific objects or documents in the archive. I'm thinking, for example, of a feminist theory course I co-taught at Dartmouth with my colleague Ivy Schweitzer in 1993. The ambitious syllabus reflects the concerns of the time. Looking back at it, I see the commitment to presenting a diverse and inclusive introduction to theorists of gender and sexual difference, from Simone de Beauvoir to Judith Butler, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Chandra Mohanty, representing divisions among different feminisms, both within the US and between what we were then calling the first and third worlds. But what the syllabus can't show, and what I'd want to think about in an oral history interview, might be some of the inevitable pitfalls of the identity-based approach to inclusion that dominated that moment. I recall our class discussions as lively and often contentious. On a largely white campus in a glaringly white town in a white state, a campus plagued by a sexist fraternity culture and a destructive reactionary student publication, the Dartmouth Review, feminist students, especially feminist students of color, were embattled. No syllabus could do justice to their sense of betrayal by the larger society, by the university, by feminism itself. Students wanted to help shape the knowledge they were acquiring. A few weeks into the term, it was a group of Jewish students who came to our office hours to complain. "You're both Jewish feminists," they told Ivy and me. "Our syllabus has readings by and about African American, Asian American, Native American, Hispanic feminisms. It spends time on third world women. We've discussed these histories at length, but where is Jewish or Jewish American feminism? Why are you leaving your own specific identities, and thus also ours, out of the course? folding them into an undifferentiated whiteness. We both immediately felt guilty, of course, but I also remember wondering whether I considered myself a Jewish feminist and what that might be. The question led to some fruitful, if unfinished, discussions about identity, inclusion, diversity, and theory in the classroom. If that moment emerges as a point of memory out of myriad such moments in nearly 50 years of teaching, it's because that discussion would continue to resonate at various moments when identity reemerged in feminist pedagogies. And as it reemerges at various times, it clearly signals that feminist thinking does not evolve in linear fashion. This is where a retrospective reflection is useful, thinking about the history of identity politics in feminism, its many returns, the difficulties working through the privilege and conflicts, and the rare and powerful moments of solidarity and recognition and coalition. What would be gained by collecting small stories such as this one as part of the archive? Perhaps these are ways of harnessing the dust as debris, constructing a history rhizomatically through details that can acquire and then also lose their significance. I'm convinced that we ourselves cannot assess the meaning of our history, but if we want to enhance the parameters of the archives we're addressing to the future, we might want to collect as many different kinds of objects as documents as we can. As the Christine Dunlop Farnham Archive clearly recognizes, oral history has the potential to enlarge and enhance archival documents and images. It can convey the processes and performances of doing theory, as well as forms of negotiation, collaboration, and conflict. It can outline histories and geographies of collaboration and the challenges of broader transnational feminist work. As the different archival materials and media speak to each other, they can reveal these connectivities and their effective and embodied textures. Preparing for my meeting with Nicole's students, I can only hope that this multidirectional feminist theory archive will make space for what we may not yet have said or even thought about the defining ideas in feminist theory, about the process of doing theory, and about archiving it. Can we liberate the archives from traditional and perhaps constraining alphabetical, chronological, linear forms of classification, I wonder? Might it be possible to visualize the archive's points of contact, connection, and interaction? The occasion of the Feminist Theory Archive's 25th anniversary inspires me to work on raising funds for an artwork. The feminist artist Andrea Geyer has worked for over a decade to map feminist connections in her ongoing project on revolt, she said. Her wall-sized diagrams draw lines among women who contributed to and shaped various museums, art projects, and institutions over time. She's done one at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and this one is from the Chicago Art Institute, which was recent. Actually, I think the San Francisco Modern Art Museum is this one. Would she make such a diagram connecting women and men whose papers are collected in the Pembroke Feminist Theory Archive and its international partners, I wonder? Such a work would help me to envision the archive both as a list of holdings and as a web of connections circling within and across time and space. In such a network, we might call it a network of complex ties. We might stop and consider different knots and nodules, each a site for the production of feminist theory. These sites could link the past to the future in an archival web of open-ended possibility. Thank you. Pardon?
I just want to be sure I want to be sure I understand one of your propositions, and that is that for the Feminist Theory Archive, we should do some oral histories, getting interconnections between the feminists there, and not leave our oral histories only in the Christine Dunlap part of the collection. Am I right about that idea? But they were focused on networks?
That was a suggestion, yes. That was my programmatic suggestion. But I also suggested consulting with my colleague Brent Edwards, who teaches a course on archives Black radicalism in the archive at Columbia right now. He said that he feels that oral histories of a movement, like Black radicalism, are very useful if they're specifically targeted to objects in the archive. And he has done some of those, and he feels that those just then open up the objects that are collected. I mean, one could do general oral histories too. That would be a little bit different. So you'll all have to decide.
And the corollary, of course, is that we need more objects in the Christine Dunlap Farnham archive. Cuts both ways.
Okay.
I particularly appreciated, it was a soft spot for me when you're talking about tenure and pitting it against one another within the academic environment. And, you know, I'm in that mode of, I'm an adjunct wasting away. And I guess I just want to ask, like, because you're also talking about looking at things retroactively and then criticizing each other. Being within that environment, what can one do? Or do you kind of, do you propose any kind of way from within that world to contribute?
I didn't.
Well,
I
do you-
didn't
so-
hear. I can't hear you very well.
Oh, really? Is this better?
Okay.
I'm
that's
sorry.
better. That's better.
So, okay, being in subjectively this environment of being pitted once against one another within the academic environment, competing for tenure and everything that entails, how can someone in that environment, I'm talking about myself but also others, kind of be objective about that and contribute to the archive in general as they're in that position, right? Because there's also so much taboo when you're there. How can you approach that criticism subjectively and objectively?
So are you asking whether we can critique the institutions that we work for and depend on
Even if
while we're in them,
while we're subject to them?
while we're subject to them? I mean, I think that's the history that this archive hopefully tells, that ways in which we have found ways to do that. I mean, and I think the little story that I told you is such a story of just trying to enlarge the structures. So of course, over the decades that I've been involved in this work and working in institutions, the work of feminist theory is also institutional work. It has to be institutional work, otherwise it can't get, you can't find the publishers, you can't stay in, and then you can't work in institutions that are inimical to the kind of thinking, or that don't make the space for the kind of thinking that I think is collected in this archive. So what are some strategies that this was one, you know, just trying to present collaboration as a challenge, setting up mentoring networks for faculty who are especially vulnerable, so that each junior person can work with a mentor to try to figure out ways to negotiate that. Setting up new journals if the journals in the field won't take innovative work that pushes against the boundaries, try to create new journals, create conferences, edited volumes. I'm sure everybody here can add more and more things. I mean, the main thing that I learned in the early days in which things were really extremely tenuous was when you're junior or even adjunct, don't act like you don't belong there. I mean, don't feel you don't belong there and you're just tolerated. Just act as though this is your place and you have to change it to fit what you need. But you have to do it with other people, and that's why I think finding the stories of collaboration in the archive would be really important to be able to transmit this history. I mean, that's really was my main point.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I especially enjoyed, I'm a student at Texas, so I especially enjoyed your Texas Ivy League drama that you were telling. I wanted to ask you, you made sort of a joke about nostalgia and your own nostalgia for the stories that you want to preserve within the archive and want to tell, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, thank you. That's such a great question. I've written about nostalgia. I know nostalgia has such a bad rap, and people are so resistant to it. But the way I envision nostalgia, not so much in my own personal life, but in some of the materials that I've worked with historically, is that nostalgia can be critical of the present. And so looking at moments in the past for models doesn't mean you're delving into what's lost and when you were younger, but it really might be finding models and moments that would enable you to look at the present from a more critical perspective. I don't know if you know Svetlana Boym's beautiful book, The Future of Nostalgia, where she distinguishes between restorative and reflective nostalgia. So restorative nostalgia is just trying to reconstruct the past as it was, but reflective nostalgia is the one that calls itself into question and is about that questioning. Suzanne.
So thank you for a really lovely, lovely talk.
You need the mic.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. So at a certain point, you mention the anthology as collective unconscious, and so that led me to think about the archive. What interacts is a kind of history of institutions, private or personal archives, and then a kind of collective unconscious archive. And so I wanted to ask you maybe to reflect a little bit on that, so how these different entities, how you see them as interacting.
Yeah, well, that's a great question and hard. Maybe you can help me. So that phrase, the collective unconscious, was Jane Gallup's.
Yes.
And it was kind of a strange project that she undertook, was to read these anthologies. And she read them with the kind of attention that she read Lacan, which was, really for me, both devastating, but also flattering. Wow, she could find, the word monstrous and how it reappears. And I think by doing that and looking at collected work, she's actually, that book in itself is a great illustration of the collectivity that shapes knowledge in a certain generation. So anthologies published over a 10, 15-year period. For feminist theory, and especially, feminist literary criticism, but also in other fields, the anthology was, in fact, when we are talking about institutional barriers, the anthology became the way to produce knowledge. The questions were huge. And the first anthology I published was on the female Bildungsroman, and I remember going to the first National Women's Studies Association conference, I think it was, and standing in the lunch line with Elizabeth Langland, whom I knew from Vanderbilt, and Elizabeth Abel, whom I was a friend of a friend, and we just happened to be getting our sandwiches together, and we're talking about our work, and has anybody written about the female, is there a female Bildungsroman? Has anybody written about this? No, well, we should edit a book on this. And by the time we got, the drinks, we had decided to do that, and that was, the moment was like, you can't really figure all these things out by yourself. You spend years on your own research, but pooling resources in an emergent field seemed like the way to do that. But what emerges sort of beyond that? So I guess the idea of a collective unconscious, which is, psychoanalytically an idea that could be debated in many different ways, and I don't know if we really want to call it that, but in these stories of collaboration, there are a lot of different things that happen that are both reflected in the work that you can read legibly in the words, but also in the process. And I think, especially for feminist theory, the process seems to me a really important thing to try to pass on and for students to study, because, and I think it's not just feminist theory, for many emergent fields, you really want to look at what made it possible to ask that question, right? And how long it took actually to ask that question, which is such an obvious question, really, but it really, sometimes it takes a very long time. So what enables that? what does that question suppress would be another way to look at it if you want to use psychoanalysis as a frame, right? And what other things might have emerged. And we certainly wouldn't ask that question in that way today. I mean, it was really a product of its moment, right? So I don't know if you had, if you were
No, that's-
thinking of
yeah,
something
no,
else
that's
when you
really
asked.
interesting. But I mean, so I'm wondering, just in terms of how one organizes, you know, search tools when the archive. I mean, you're Nicole, right? Need to
Yeah.
sort of call you up, right? Because maybe the search tools for the archive don't necessarily make those kinds of connections clear, and so that's something that we should all be thinking about, I guess.
So, indexing categories are so important and can really, I mean, that's what I said about the constraints of using folders and alphabet and chronology. I mean, there are many things that you don't find by using those systems of classification, as we know. And even in oral histories, when you start using transcription, as we talked about in the conference last week that we had on Palestinian archives, when you use transcription for oral sources, you're missing a lot, and people think that you can read through and figure out what you want to then look at, but you might find a completely different story if you watch it. So I think those organizational questions, I think, could be a course in themselves, because I think you would have to ask so many larger questions before you came up with your search terms. I mean, that would have been another course I could have invented. Yes?
Is this document available for, I just wanted to ask if this document was.
It's hard to see, I'm sorry. So this is an artwork by an artist called Andrea Geyer, and she gets commissioned by different museums to produce it for there. So this is at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, SF MoMA, and I think what she does is trace the history of San Francisco, California art, art production and collection and donors and so on, and create connections between the different women to kind of highlight the history of women behind that institution. And she did one for the Museum of Modern Art in New York as well. So it's called Revolt, she said, and she's done a number of these.
So you might find it in a book,
You could probably find it online.
online?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you could find it online because I took it from the website. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I wanted to say I was a student of Naomi Shores in the 80s, and she was so, so, so important to me, and I just wanted to sort of share some stories about that. One of the things that she did that was really kind of monumental was she refused to let us write about the most important texts. For example, if we were reading Balzac, we had to read the text that nobody had ever written about, because she felt that the work we were doing was on, whatever we were doing had to be the first that was done. So she didn't want us to just repeat someone else's interpretation of that text. Why write about Pere Goriot if it had already been addressed? And so that kind of validation was so important. The other thing that I wanted to say about being a student of hers was that I did not become a literature professor, but I became a filmmaker. And when I look back at her guidance when, as a teacher with us as students, I felt like she was teaching us to see. So she would spend an entire afternoon looking at one description of a bedroom, and we had to, and so I think that translates to my filmmaking, because we had to learn how the bedroom was built, how it was described, and where we found ourselves as active spectators in that bedroom. It wasn't just, most professors of literature would say, well, let's move through those descriptions and get to the heart of it, or even get to the feminist. And she never actually wanted us to, it seemed to me, to do a feminist reading per se. It was more of just an expansive, discursive reading, and then we would find our place there as women, and that was really, really, really special. When I looked at the fragments that you talked about, it reminded me of the way that people are reappraising Emily Dickinson now, and they're talking about things that weren't published. Those little details that she wrote on envelopes are now being celebrated. And so I really loved that you were looking at Post-its. I mean, Post-its were kind of new then. So they don't have their stick, but they stick with our minds, and it's really fantastic that you brought that to our attention. So thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I mean, that's great. There's an Emily Dickinson exhibit now at the Morgan Library in New York, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm expecting to find, things like that. I'm wondering whether focusing on one scene, like a bedroom scene, it's interesting that you say bedroom, whether that isn't just by nature of feminist reading, that you don't just have to talk about the plot. It's the method of looking and reading that will define what a feminist reading is. So I think she was probably doing that. That's the way I felt. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's fascinating. I was interested in particularly by that phrase, I think it was digital or technological rot, which I find good. And on that point, I'm interested in how you consider, we will navigate future archives, especially, that are going to be much more digitally based. I'm thinking at once kind of Twitter, for instance, an author's Twitter feed, each is having that archived and how unwieldy that is. But also thinking of social media, how carefully curated it is, and how this might be, we might never see the tweets that get deleted, but also, so I'm wondering at once how you think future archivists will navigate the idea that you never look at you look at the Twitter feed and you never see the tweets that are there, and how we will navigate all these unwieldy digital areas going forward.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a crucial question, and we have archivists in the room who really should be answering it. What I did was check with my friend and colleague Lori Novak, who's a photographer and does a lot of stuff with the digital world, and I said, well, what would I say, if you look 10 years ahead about what happens, and what one can donate? And she helped me think through all the stuff that we're actually not archiving. So all those file folders, were just like snapshots of my messy file folders in my file cabinet. I still have some of those folders, but a lot of my course notes and research for my classes is really on my hard disk. And trying to find the syllabus for this course I was telling you about from '93, I really couldn't open the syllabus. I finally opened it with a lot of effort, but I had, it had all these funny symbols in it, so I could hardly, make sense of it. Now, I'm assuming that, when I donate my papers to Pembroke, they'll figure out how to open all these things. But I also am very aware of the fact, as somebody working on photography, that we're a generation that's producing probably more, not probably, more photographs than any previous generation, but we will probably end up with fewer, if any, by the end of it, because the only thing that actually survives is paper. So, but we haven't yet, we're so happy to save on file space because we don't have to print everything out. So I'm very aware of the fleetingness of all that and how all that has shifted. But I think it's for the archivist to really answer the question. What keeps you up at night?
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm the new archivist. So I think about digital archives, right? There's a good reason to fear, and there's a good reason to hope, right? So there's a number of historians around archives right now that are saying that we're entering a digital dark age of archives, right? And that your digital data is much more vulnerable to be lost. And in essence, a lot of it will be lost, right? On the other hand, archives, we have found a way. We have always found a way to capture history and secure it for the record. And it's my hope and my belief through technologies like Twitter captures, linked open data, that our archivists are working hard, and we are gonna get there. It's a matter of time. I think that there will be a period of time where there's a lull, where a lot of information is lost, and then will come up again. That's what I think. And I also think that there's a lot of digital junk, right? And part of what being an archivist is about is curating the stuff that really counts. And so we may not capture all 500,000 of the images that you've taken over the course of your lifetime, but we may get 1,000, 10,000 of those images that are really sweet and that show you with the people in your life that are making history or something like that. So up and down.
I'd like to comment on this question too, because Jill Lepore, the historian, wrote a terrifying article that in 5 years after we put links in our articles, all those links are dead. 50% of the links are dead within 5 years. So that's kind of scary when you think about digital publication and you insert your link and then won't be there. And working with the Columbia libraries and the archivists there realized that one of the many things we need libraries for now, and they're really endangered in terms of the support, is that they're developing the platforms to hold digital data and then renew the platform so that they can capture digital change. And if you don't have these huge repositories well supported, we won't have those platforms that can be renewed. And so that's really interesting right now when we're thinking about funding things for the public good. You know, it's very important that we have library consortia developing these platforms and sharing them. And no one university actually can do it alone. It's kind of scary if we don't do it. It's a kind of infrastructure that if we don't build, the knowledge really will be gone.
Just about funding around digital archiving, right? Just about funding around digital archiving, right? The thing is that we really do, the head of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library has said, James Roth, has said that institutions need to be fundraising at the level of buildings to dedicate to digital preservation. So as colleges and universities fundraise $15 million for a building, they really need to be fundraising at that level for digital preservation in their libraries, if it's going to be done right. And so it's this very, very high cost, and to ask libraries and archives to carry that burden is really pretty crazy. So these institutions need to band together and dedicate themselves to the preservation of this material.
So in response, let me just tell you another story. One of the models I wanted to use for what I was envisioning was the Women, Art, and Revolution War Project. Do you all know about this? This was a book and then a website and the histories of a number of women artists who were really important to the feminist art movement in the 80s. And they were envisioning this fabulous interactive website that would be growing and would be interactive so people could put more things on. And I was kind of playing with, reading about it, I was playing with the idea of building on that for the Feminist Theory Archives, and I wanted to show you the website. Well, the website is down. It doesn't exist. So, I mean, there was like so much noise about how great it will be. It's non-existent. I couldn't find it. So I haven't yet done the research about where it went and what happened with it. I just didn't have time. But, I mean, it's sobering. Yes, Victoria.
This is just a very quick comment in reaction to what Jean and Mary were saying, and the importance of having these kinds of particular archives and supporting them, because as we have heard, you know, in the first 100 days of Trump, you know, there was an effort to erase all of the information around climate change. And a whole group of scientists have come together to make sure that that information is secure. And it just made me think, as we were talking about this, how absolutely vital it is to have these particular archives and with specific information supported.
There's going to be a national march in support of science led by scientists next month. It's really important to everybody to join on because a lot of it is about data preservation.
you. Thank you.